The air in Mr. Abernathy's office was heavy with the scent of old paper, floor wax, and reheated coffee. A smell of endings. I felt every second drag by, each tick of the grandfather clock on the wall sounding like a hammer blow to my skull. I found out everything that day. In that beige room, with the dusty blinds cutting the Wichita afternoon light into stripes across the mahogany desk. The lawyer opened that manila envelope, and the sound of tearing paper was the sound of my entire life splitting in two, the will. And to my wife, Margaret Louise Carter, Mr. Abernathy's monotonous voice droned on. I leave the entirety of the farm, the savings, and all material possessions, on one condition. I shifted in the leather chair, which groaned in protest. One condition? Richard had always been a man of conditions. Life with him was a contract of unspoken clauses, of expectations I could never quite meet. But a condition in his will? What more could he possibly want from me, now that he was dead? Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, adjusted the glasses on the tip of his nose, and read the paragraph that would change everything. He read words about truth, about secrets, about a burden Richard had carried, and that now, in his final act of control, he was passing to me. He confessed in cold legal language that he had known from the very beginning that David was not his son, that he knew Sarah wasn't his either, and that Michael, my youngest, was not his son. 3 children, 3 different fathers. None of them were Richard Carter. The room began to spin. The stripes of light on the walls seemed to writhe like snakes. I gripped the arms of the chair, feeling the cool, smooth leather under my sweaty palms. The lawyer stopped reading, his face a mask of embarrassed professionalism, waiting for my reaction. But I had no reaction. I was an empty shell, the sound of the ocean replaced by a sharp, deafening hum. 60 years. 60 years of living a lie I didn't even know existed, carrying guilt that was never mine, feeling inadequate, flawed, a wife who couldn't reach her own husband's heart. And the whole time, the reason wasn't me. It was him. It was his knowledge. Have you ever felt that kind of truth rip through your chest? It's not a clean pain, like a knife cut. It's messy, jagged, as if someone tossed a lit match into a barn full of gasoline and locked the door. It's an explosion that burns everything, that turns all your memories to ash. In that moment, I felt the heat of that explosion consume me from the inside, and as the flames rose, consuming the woman I thought I was, I wondered if anything would be left to tell the story. Believe me, there are stories that need to be told, truths that need to surface, no matter how late. If you, like me, believe in the power of a true story to connect and heal us, consider subscribing to this channel, because my journey, the real journey, was just beginning in that dusty office. My name is Margaret Louise Carter, née Miller. I'm 74 years old, and most of them have been lived under the vast, unforgiving Kansas sky. I was born and raised in a small farming community, squeezed between Salina and Abilene, where the horizons are so wide they seem to swallow the sun every night. My world was made of dirt, of cornfields that whispered secrets to the wind, and of wheat fields that rippled like a golden ocean. Life was hard, simple, and predictable. My parents were farmers, people of few words and many calluses on their hands. I learned more about the cycle of the seasons from watching the land than from reading books. Work in the fields began before the sun rose and ended long after it set. The hoe was a more constant companion than any doll. The beauty of that place was stark, a beauty that demanded effort to be seen. The smell of damp earth after a rain, the sound of cicadas on hot August nights, the sight of a storm building in the west, with dark, heavy clouds rolling over the plains. These were the things that shaped my soul. But life in a small community is also restrictive. Everyone knows everyone. Every misstep is noted. Every deviation from the norm is commented on in whispers at the general store or after the Sunday service. I was a dreamy girl, my head full of stories I read in books borrowed from the traveling library. I dreamed of big cities, of pretty dresses, of a life less predictable than that of the women in my family, who seemed to be born to marry, have children, and grow old tending to a patch of land and a silent man. I married young, at 18, in the late 60s. Richard Carter was a few years older, a handsome, serious young man, the son of a neighboring farmer. He seemed strong, stable, a safe harbor amidst my youthful uncertainties. At least that's what I thought, what I needed to think. The truth is, I was scared and alone, and Richard offered me a name, a home, a semblance of normality, and I accepted. Our life together was built on that fragile foundation. I spent the following decades playing the role assigned to me, the farmer's wife. I took care of the house, a white wooden structure that creaked in the wind, planted a vegetable garden out back, cooked 3 meals a day, and raised the children. I was the glue that held the family together, the person who absorbed the tensions and swallowed her words to keep the peace, as my mother had always advised. A happy marriage, Maggie, she would say with her tired eyes, is made more of things left unsaid than things said. On the outside, we were the Carter family, respectable, hardworking, a fixture in the community landscape. On the inside, however, I was coming apart, little by little, with each passing year. Richard was a dry man, as hard and unyielding as the Kansas soil during a drought. He believed displays of affection were a sign of weakness. A compliment was a rarity, a gentle touch, a seismic event. His love, if it existed, was shown through material provision, a roof over our heads, food on the table, but my soul was starving. I carried all the pregnancies practically alone, the morning sickness, the growing weight in my belly, the nighttime fears. Richard saw it as women's business. The births were solitary events, conducted in the small-town hospital with kind but busy nurses as my only companions. Richard would stay in the waiting room, impatient, as if waiting for a tractor part to be delivered. The sleepless nights with sick children, the sound of coughing echoing through the silent house, a warm forehead against my hand. I faced it all while his chair at the dinner table remained empty. He would spend hours at the Roadhouse bar, the dusty boot, coming home late, the smell of beer and smoke clinging to his clothes, muttering about the harvest, about the government, about the cold food I left for him in the oven. Decades passed like this. You get used to it. You learn to find small joys in your children's smiles, in the taste of a well-made apple pie, in the scent of the roses I stubbornly cultivated near the porch. A woman comes to believe that sadness isn't a state, but a destination. That happiness is something that happens to other people in movies, in books, and then you stop waiting for it. The drive back from Mr. Abernathy's office to the farm seemed to take an eternity. I drove my old Ford pickup, the same one Richard used, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The late afternoon sun painted the sky orange and purple, a painful beauty I could barely register. The words from the will echoed in my head, each one a stone thrown at the fragile windows of my memory. None of my 3 children were his. How could I not have known? How could I have lived beside a man for over 50 years and not realize the sheer size of the chasm between us? The lie wasn't mine. The lie was his, and he had used it to build me a prison. The truck rolled to a stop on the gravel driveway of the farm, and the sound of the dying engine was replaced by a silence that seemed louder than any noise. The white wooden house, its paint beginning to peel near the windows, looked like a stranger. For 56 years, this place had been my universe. Every creaking floorboard, every water stain on the kitchen ceiling, every notch on the doorframe where we measured the children's height, it all told the story of my life. The story I now knew was a fiction. I went inside and closed the door behind me. The familiar smell of the house, a mix of wood, dust, and the faint scent of the lavender soap I used, hit me. But today it brought no comfort. It brought nausea. The hallway seemed longer, darker. The photographs on the wall watched me with accusing eyes. There were wedding photos, Richard and I, young and serious, staring at a future neither of us could have predicted. There were baby pictures. David, a wrinkled newborn in my arms. Sarah, with a clumsy bow on her sparse hair. Michael, grinning a toothless smile. And in every family photo there was Richard, standing slightly apart, a forced smile on his lips, his eyes always distant. I had always thought it was just his way, shy, reserved, a man uncomfortable with displays of affection. Now, I saw the truth. It wasn't shyness. It was contempt. It was the weight of a secret he had turned into a weapon against me. I walked to the living room and stopped in front of his armchair. A brown leather armchair, worn and cracked at the arms, the shape of his body permanently imprinted on the seat. It was his throne, the place from which he watched the news, read the paper, judged the world, and silently judged me. For countless nights, I had sat on the opposite sofa, trying to start a conversation, sharing an anecdote about the children or a worry about the crops, only to be met with a monosyllabic grunt or the turn of a newspaper page. Anger, an emotion I had spent my whole life suppressing, began to bubble up inside me. A hot, acidic anger that rose in my throat. I looked at the empty armchair, and for the first time, I didn't feel the ache of his absence. I felt relief. A specific memory, sharp as a shard of glass, came to my mind. David was about 8 years old. He had spent the entire afternoon building a model airplane from a wooden kit, a birthday present I had bought him with money I'd saved from selling eggs. He was so proud. He ran to show Richard as soon as he walked in the door, the fragile little plane held out in his hands. "Dad, look what I made," he said, his eyes shining with expectation. Richard barely glanced at it. He walked past David, threw his hat on the hook, and went straight to the kitchen. "I'm hungry, Margaret," was all he said. I saw the light go out in David's eyes. I saw his small shoulders slump. That night, he took the plane apart, piece by piece, and never touched it again. At the time, I made excuses for Richard's behavior. He was tired, worried about the drought. He wasn't good with children. The excuses were a balm I applied to my own wounds and to my children's. Now, I saw the scene with brutal clarity. It wasn't tiredness. It was cruelty. It was a constant reminder to himself and somehow to the universe that this boy was not his. Every act of coldness, every harsh word, every gesture of indifference, it was his silent revenge. And I, and my children, were the innocent victims of a war we didn't even know was being fought. I walked to the wall and took one of the family photos down. The wooden frame was heavy in my hands. It was the 5 of us, in front of the house, on a Thanksgiving about 20 years ago. Everyone smiling for the camera, a portrait of suburban happiness, a framed lie. With a sob that turned into a cry of rage, I threw the photo on the floor. The glass shattered, scattering glittering shards across the wooden floorboards. The sound echoed through the silent house, the first act of rebellion in 56 years. My children, David, Sarah, and Michael. They were my life, the only true and solid thing in the midst of the farce that had been my marriage. Now, even their foundation was about to be shaken. The thought of telling them the truth filled me with a dread so deep it was nearly paralyzing. How do you tell a 55-year-old man that the man he called father his entire life was not, in fact, his father? How do you explain to a 52-year-old woman that her family identity was built on a lie? And how do you look your youngest son, 48, in the eyes and admit a truth that will redefine everything he knows about himself? David, my firstborn. He lived in Kansas City, Missouri. He was the most like Richard in temperament, or at least, the persona Richard presented to the world. Pragmatic, responsible, a bit emotionally distant. He'd become a successful engineer, a man who believed in logic, in facts, in practical solutions. His relationship with Richard had always been tense, a silent battle of wills. David sought an approval that Richard was never willing to give. Now I understood why. For David, this news wouldn't just be an emotional wound. It would be a collapse of his ordered, logical worldview. He would want facts, names, dates, questions I might not be able to answer. Sarah, my only daughter, lived in Denver, Colorado. She was my opposite and at the same time, my reflection. Emotional, empathetic, an artist who saw the world in colors and feelings, not black and white. She was always the family peacemaker, the one who felt everyone's pain. Her relationship with Richard was one of silent sorrow. She would try to connect with him, to bring some warmth to his coldness, but would always retreat, hurt by his indifference. Sarah would feel this news as a deep betrayal, not just by Richard, but perhaps by me as well. She would cry, she would ask questions about my suffering, and her pain would be a mirror of my own. The thought of causing her that pain was like swallowing glass. And Michael, my youngest, he was the free spirit, the one who'd gone the farthest, living in Tulsa, Oklahoma, working as a musician. He had always been the most observant, the quietest. His way of dealing with the heavy atmosphere in our home was to withdraw, to create his own world. He had an almost non-existent relationship with Richard. They were like two strangers living under the same roof. Michael distanced himself to protect himself. I feared this revelation would make him withdraw even further, perhaps for good. He might see it as the final confirmation that he never truly belonged in that family, in that house. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they did their homework, where we celebrated birthdays, where we had arguments and laughter. The phone was on the wall, an old rotary model Richard had refused to replace. It looked like an artifact from a bygone era, just like me. Picking up the receiver and dialing their numbers felt like the most monumental task of my life. What would I say? "Hello, dear. I have some news. By the way, your father isn't your father." The words seemed absurd, cruel, but Richard's will had given me no choice. He had lit the fuse and left the room, leaving me to deal with the explosion. Perhaps that was his intention all along, his final act of control, of punishment. I thought about not telling them, about burying the secret along with him, letting my children live with the comfortable lie they had always known. But the lie was no longer comfortable for me. It was a poison, and I couldn't live with it coursing through my veins anymore. They deserved the truth, however painful it might be. They deserved to know the truth about the man who had raised them with such contempt, and perhaps they deserved to know the truth about their mother, not the patient saint they thought I was, but a young, scared woman who made mistakes and paid for them for over half a century. The sun had set, and the kitchen was bathed in twilight. I didn't turn on the light. The darkness felt appropriate. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in my lungs. I had to be strong, for them, and for the first time in a long time, for myself. I picked up the phone. My trembling finger went to the first hole on the rotary dial. David's number. Before making the call, a compulsive need took hold of me. I needed more than the cold, legal words of the will. I needed physical proof of Richard's duplicity, something to anchor my anger, to make it real and justified, not just the delusions of a grieving widow. I went up the creaking stairs, each step a familiar groan, and into our bedroom, the bedroom we had shared for 56 years. The patchwork quilt I had made myself was stretched perfectly over the bed. On his side, the nightstand was exactly as he'd left it. A glass of water, a book on the Civil War with the bookmark halfway through, and his reading glasses. All so normal, so mundane, a lie of normality. I went to his closet. The smell of his clothes, a mix of mothballs and his pine-scented soap, hit me, and for a moment my stomach churned. I opened the door and pushed aside his suits and plaid shirts, all hung in impeccable order. At the back of the closet, on the floor, was a small metal box, the kind used for tools or fishing tackle. I had always known it was there, but never had the curiosity or the courage to open it. Richard said he kept important papers in it, and I, the obedient wife, never questioned him. The box was locked. A small brass padlock kept it sealed. Frustration washed over me. It was another one of his barriers, another locked secret. But the woman who had left Mr. Abernathy's office was not the same woman who had lived in this house her whole life. I went down to the garage, my heart pounding, and returned with a hammer and a screwdriver. The sound of metal striking metal was shocking in the silence of the room. I struck the padlock with a fury I didn't know I possessed. Each blow was for a lonely night, for a cruel word, for a dismissive gesture. Each blow was for my children. Finally, with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. Breathing heavily, I lifted the lid. The contents were not what I expected. There were no property deeds or insurance policies. There were letters, dozens of letters, tied in small bundles with twine, and photographs. I picked up the first bundle. The letters were drafts, written in Richard's tight, angular handwriting. They were dated from the late 60s. They were addressed to a man named Thomas Riley, in Omaha, Nebraska. My blood ran cold. Thomas Riley. The young traveling salesman who told me he loved me, who promised me a future, and who vanished as soon as I told him I was pregnant with David. I read Richard's words, and horror enveloped me like a shroud. He had found Thomas. He had written to him, not with anger or wounded honor, but with a calculated coldness. He described the situation, the burden he was taking on by marrying me, and subtly, yet unmistakably, asked for money. A contribution toward the boy's upbringing would be the gesture of a decent man, he wrote. Blackmail, pure and simple. There was a reply from Thomas, short and sharp, saying he had no money and that the child was my problem, not his. My stomach turned over. Richard hadn't just known. He had tried to profit from my desperation and his supposed nobility. He didn't save me. He bought me. He bought me knowing I came with a debt he could hold over me forever. There were other bundles. One contained drafts of letters to a man named Daniel Peterson, a musician who had spent a summer working on a neighboring farm, a man with whom I had shared a few weeks of warmth and laughter during one of the coldest periods of my marriage. The letters were about Sarah, the same veiled demand for money, the same blackmail, and the last bundle, letters to a certain Dr. Miller, from Abilene, a married man with whom I'd had one desperate, regrettable encounter. The letters were about Michael. He knew. He had known everything, the entire time. Every one of my darkest, most shameful secrets had been no secret to him. He had kept them in that metal box, like a butterfly collector keeps his pinned specimens. He would visit them, relive them, and use the knowledge of them to fuel his resentment, his silent cruelty. Beneath the letters was a small black and white photograph. It was me, around 17, standing near the old barn. I was smiling, a genuine smile, full of a hope I could barely remember. On the back, in my teenage script, was written, Maggie, summer of 65, dreaming of the future. Richard had kept that photo, the photo of the girl he would methodically destroy, year after year, keeping her trapped in a cage of silence and secrets. The anger I had felt before was replaced by something deeper, colder, a chilling clarity. The shock had passed. The pain was still there, but it now had a purpose. I wasn't just telling my children the truth to free them. I was telling it to free myself, to finally give a voice to the girl in the photograph, the girl whose dreams had been locked away in that metal box along with the evidence of her imprisonment. With the metal box open on the floor beside me, the memories returned, no longer as hazy fragments, but with a painful, vivid clarity. The story of David, the origin of it all. I was 17. The summer of 1967 was hot and dry, and the Kansas dust seemed to settle on everything, including my soul. I felt trapped, suffocated by the inevitability of my life, marrying a local boy, inheriting my parents' worries, and watching my own dreams dry up like the corn in the field. And then, Thomas Riley appeared. He was a traveling salesman for tractor parts, from Omaha. He wasn't like the local boys. He wore brightly colored shirts, drove a sky blue convertible, and talked about cities I only knew from maps and school books. He had an easy smile and eyes that seemed to see past the farm girl, that saw the woman I dreamed of being. To a 17-year-old girl who had never left her county, he was the whole world. We met at the town diner. He bought me a Coke, and we talked for hours. He told me stories of Chicago, of New Orleans. I told him about my dreams of becoming a teacher. He listened to me, truly listened. It was the first time I felt someone was genuinely interested in what went on inside my head, not just what my hands could do on the farm. The romance was swift and intense, a whirlwind of secret meetings in the old barn, of late-night drives under the starry sky, of promises whispered in the dark. He told me he loved me. He said he would come back for me, that we would get married and live in a big city where I could go to college. And I, naive and starved for affection, believed every word. 2 weeks later, he was gone, promising to return in a month. A month passed, then 2. The letters I wrote to the address he gave me came back stamped, addressee unknown. And then, the morning sickness began. The panic was a cold, suffocating thing. In our community, at that time, an unwed, pregnant girl was more than a shame. She was a catastrophe. It meant ostracism for me, and a deep humiliation for my family. I hid the truth for as long as I could, wearing loose clothes, praying it was all a mistake. But the body doesn't lie. It was my mother who found out. She didn't yell. She just looked at me with a disappointment so deep in her eyes that it hurt more than any beating. My father stopped speaking to me. His silence was a wall of condemnation. I was alone, terrified, with a life growing inside me and no future in sight. That's when Richard Carter entered the picture. He was older, quiet, and had always watched me from a distance. His family was one of the most respected in the area. One day, he showed up on our porch. He spoke to my father for a long time. Afterward, my father called me into the living room. Richard offered to marry me. He said he would claim the child as his own, that he would give it, and me, a name, that no one needed to know the truth. He spoke calmly, practically, as if he were negotiating the purchase of livestock. There were no words of love, not even affection. There was a proposal, a solution. I looked at my father's face, a man broken by shame. I looked at my future, a dark and dead-end road. And I looked at Richard, my savior. I didn't love him. I barely knew him. But he was offering me a lifeline, and I was drowning. So I said yes. We were married 2 weeks later in a simple, somber ceremony at the courthouse. I wore a borrowed dress that barely concealed my growing belly. The few people present looked at us with a mixture of pity and suspicion. I felt like a fraud. Now, reading Richard's letters to Thomas, I realized the fraud was far greater than I had imagined. Richard hadn't married me out of kindness or some secret love. He married me, knowing I was broken. He saw an opportunity. By saving me, he made me his eternal debtor. He owned me, He knew my sin, and he would use it as an invisible chain for the rest of my life. He wasn't offering me a safe harbor. He was building his own prison, and inviting me to be his cellmate. David's birth, a few months later, was not a celebration. It was the sentence being sealed, and I, unknowingly, spent the next 56 years serving time for a crime that he, my supposed savior, had used to shackle me. I couldn't sleep that night. The house, normally a sanctuary of silence, seemed alive with the ghosts of the past. Every creak of the floorboards, every whistle of the wind outside, seemed to whisper Richard's name. After hours of tossing and turning in the empty bed, I gave up. I went downstairs, the darkness of the house familiar, and into the living room. The full moon cast a pale bluish light through the window, illuminating Richard's brown leather armchair. It looked like an empty throne, waiting for its king, but the king was dead, and the queen, after a lifetime of silent servitude, had finally found her voice. I sat on the sofa opposite the armchair, the same place I had spent countless nights in silence, but this time, the silence would not be mine. I pictured him there, sitting as he always did, with his impassive face, his large calloused hands resting on the arms of the chair, and I began to speak. "You thought you'd get away with it, didn't you, Richard?" I began, my voice a hoarse whisper in the stillness of the room. "You thought you could just write it all down on a piece of paper, leave it for a lawyer to read, and that would be it? One last blow, one last knife in my back, and then nothing. Silence. Peace for you, and a living hell for me." I waited, as if he might answer. The silence was his usual reply. 56 years, I continued, my voice gaining strength. "I gave you 56 years of my life. I cooked your meals. I washed your clothes. I raised the children you pretended were yours. I kept this house. I cared for you when you were sick. And what did I get in return? Silence, contempt, a cold look that made me feel like a piece of furniture. I stood up and began to pace the room, nervous energy propelling me. I blame myself, for all those years. I thought I was the problem, that I wasn't a good enough wife, that I wasn't pretty enough, or smart enough, or interesting enough for you. I made myself smaller to fit into the tiny space you allowed me to occupy. I erased myself, little by little, until there was almost nothing left. All to keep the peace, all to keep the family together. I stopped in front of the armchair, staring at the empty space where his head would have been. And you knew, the whole time. You married me knowing about David. You watched me make the other mistakes, with Sarah, with Michael. You saw my desperation, my loneliness, and what did you do? Did you offer comfort? A shoulder to cry on? No. You saved it. You collected my failings like they were trophies. You locked them in that metal box and used them to poison me, day after day, with your indifference. My voice was trembling, not with weakness, but with a cleansing rage. Why, Richard? Why such cruelty? Was it to feel superior? To feel in control? Was it to punish me for not being the perfect wife you thought you deserved? The truth is, you were a coward, a man so small, so insecure, that you had to destroy the woman beside you just to feel a little bit taller. You didn't save me. You used me. You used me and my children to build a life of lies that made you look respectable to the world. The tears finally came, hot and furious. They were not tears of sadness. They were tears of liberation. You wanted to break me, but you didn't. I survived you. I survived your silence, your contempt. And now, I will survive your truth. And you know what? This truth, this weapon you left behind to destroy me, is going to be my liberation. My children will know who you really were. And I will finally know who I am, without you, without your shadow covering me. I leaned forward, placing my hands on the worn arms of the chair, the leather cool beneath my palms. Your reign is over, Richard. This house is no longer your castle. It's my house, and there's no more room for you here. I stood there, breathing deeply, my chest aching, but lighter than it had been in decades. In the pale moonlight, the armchair looked like just that, an old, empty piece of furniture. The ghost of Richard Carter had been exorcised, and in the silence that followed, for the first time, I heard the sound of my own strength. After the confession to an empty armchair, a strange calm settled over me. It was the calm in the eye of the storm, I knew, but a calm nonetheless. Dawn found me in the kitchen, the metal box open on the table, the bundles of letters arranged like evidence at a trial. It was time to face the second story, Sarah's story. It happened about 3 years after David was born. My marriage to Richard had already settled into its pattern of coldness and distance. He worked tirelessly on the farm, and I worked tirelessly in the house. We were business partners, not life partners. The nights were the worst. He would sit in his armchair, I on the sofa, the space between us an unbridgeable chasm. Sometimes the loneliness was so physical, I felt I couldn't breathe. That summer, a new family rented the neighboring Johnson farm. As the Johnsons had gone to spend the season with their daughter in California, the Peterson family, they had a son, Daniel. He was in his early 20s, a music student, there to help his parents and earn some money before going back to college. Daniel was the opposite of Richard. Where Richard was silence, Daniel was melody. He played his guitar on his porch on warm evenings, and the sound would float across the fields to my window. They were folk songs, soft and melancholic, that spoke of love and loss and faraway places. They seemed to give voice to everything I felt and couldn't express. We met at the fence that divided our properties. I was picking tomatoes in my garden, and he came over to borrow some sugar. He smiled, and the sun seemed to concentrate in that smile. We started talking about music, about books, about the unbearable Kansas heat. He asked about my life, and I found myself telling him things I had never told anyone, not even myself. He didn't judge me. He just listened, with an intensity that made me feel seen for the first time in years. What happened next wasn't planned. It was a spontaneous combustion, born of loneliness and kindness. It was stolen conversations by the fence, brief, secret meetings in the woods that ran behind both properties. He read me poetry. I brought him slices of blackberry pie. He touched my arm one day, and the warmth of his touch was so shocking, so alive, that I pulled back as if from an electric shock. On one particularly oppressive afternoon, Richard had gone to a cattle auction in another town and wouldn't be back until the next day. The house was silent, empty. Daniel appeared at my back door, claiming his truck had broken down. It was a flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. He came inside, and the outside world seemed to disappear. In my neat, sterile kitchen, he was an explosion of life, of color, of sound. He kissed me, and it was like drinking water after dying of thirst for years. It was a single mistake, a single afternoon where I allowed myself to be something other than Richard Carter's wife. I was Margaret, just Margaret, and I felt alive. The regret and guilt that followed were overwhelming. When Richard returned, I could barely look him in the eye. I felt marked, tainted. Daniel left at the end of the summer, back to college, and I never saw him again. When I found out I was pregnant with Sarah, panic consumed me. But to my surprise, Richard said nothing. I expected an explosion, accusations, but he just took the news with his usual stoicism. Looking back now, with his letters to Daniel in my hands, I understood. He didn't need to say anything. He knew. How he knew, I'll never understand. Maybe he saw something, heard a rumor, or maybe he just knew the depth of my loneliness and assumed the inevitable. But he knew, and his silence wasn't an act of forgiveness. It was an act of power. He let me marinate in my own guilt, believing I had a terrible secret I was keeping from him. And he used that unspoken secret to tighten the chains even more. He grew even more distant, colder. He never held Sarah as a baby unless it was absolutely necessary. He watched her from afar, with an unreadable expression. And I, consumed with guilt, tried to overcompensate. I loved Sarah with a desperate ferocity, as if my love could somehow erase the truth of her origin. For 52 years, I carried the blame for the sadness in Sarah's eyes, for the way she always sought her father's affection in vain. I believed it was my punishment, but the punishment wasn't just mine. It was hers too. Richard punished her for a crime that wasn't hers, for a betrayal he used for his own sick benefit. The cruelty of it, the depth of his depravity, was almost incomprehensible. I looked at the phone again. The next call would be to her, to my sensitive, big-hearted girl, and I would have to tell her that the father who neglected her wasn't her father, and that the mother who overprotected her was, in part, trying to protect herself. The hand holding the receiver was cold but steady. The conversation with Richard's empty armchair had given me a strength I didn't know I had. I dialed Sarah's number in Denver. Each click of the rotary dial felt like a step toward the inevitable. The phone rang 3 times before she answered, her warm, familiar voice on the other end of the line. "Mom, is everything okay? It's rare for you to call this late." Her immediate concern was like a knife in my chest. I was about to destroy her peace. "Hello, sweetie. Yes, I'm fine. Don't you worry. I lied. Do you have a minute to talk? Of course, Mom. Always. Did something happen? She could already sense the tension in my voice. Sarah was always like that, a seismograph for the emotions of those around her. I took a deep breath. There was no easy way to say it. Just the truth, stark and raw. Sarah, I need you to sit down. What I have to tell you is, it's very difficult. There was a moment of silence, and I could hear her settling into a chair. Okay, Mom. I'm sitting. You're scaring me. I know, sweetie. I'm sorry. My voice broke. Today I went to Mr. Abernathy's office for the reading of your father's will. Oh, right. How did it go? She asked, her voice soft. He left a letter. A confession. The words came out in a rush. Sarah, Richard was not your biological father. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. So profound I wondered if the call had dropped. I could picture her face, the confusion turning to shock, her large brown eyes filling with tears. Mom, what? Her voice was a whisper, fragile and disbelieving. What are you saying? Is this some kind of sick joke? No, my love. I wish it were. The tears I'd been holding back began to stream down my face. It's all here, in his will. He knew. He always knew. Always knew? Knew what? Mom, I don't understand. She was starting to panic. He wasn't the biological father to any of you, I said, the sentence landing like an anvil in the silence between us. Not you, not David, not Michael. A sob escaped her, a sound of pure, raw pain that broke my heart. No, it can't be. This is crazy. Mom, maybe you misunderstood. Maybe the grief is... I didn't misunderstand, Sarah. I interrupted, my voice firmer than I expected. I found letters, drafts of letters he wrote. He knew who your real fathers were. He tried to get money from them. The sound of her crying intensified. Oh my God, Mom. Honey, I know it's a shock. I am so sorry. I'm so sorry you have to find out like this. So, my whole life, she said between sobs. The way he treated me, the distance. It wasn't because there was something wrong with me. Her question, so full of an old and settled pain, hit me with the force of a punch. Her entire life, my sensitive, loving daughter, had blamed herself for her father's coldness. No, my love, it was never you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. There was never anything wrong with you. The wrongness was his. The cruelty was his. And you, Mom? She asked, her voice still trembling. You lived with this? How did you bear it? I didn't know that he knew, I confessed. That's the hardest part. I carried my own secrets, my own guilt, for all these years, thinking I was protecting everyone. And the whole time, he knew, and he used it to punish us. We were silent for a long time, the only sound her ragged breathing. I let her process, let her feel. I didn't offer empty words of comfort. There was no comfort to be had in that moment, only the hard, cold reality. Finally, she spoke, her voice calmer, but filled with a new resolve. Do David and Michael know? Not yet. I called you first. They have to know. We need to come home. We need to be with you, she said. I'll call David. Can you call Michael? Yes, I said, a wave of relief washing over me. I wouldn't be alone in this. Yes, I can. Okay, Mom. Hang in there. We're on our way. I love you. I love you too, my darling. More than you'll ever know. We hung up, and I leaned against the kitchen wall, exhausted, but also with a thread of hope. The first crack in the dam had been made. The water was beginning to flow. It would be a flood, I knew. But maybe, just maybe, when the waters receded, something new and more true could grow in its place. The conversation with Sarah was like lighting a fuse. I knew the explosion would be swift, and that it would spread. Less than an hour later, my phone rang. It was David. His voice was tense, controlled, but I could hear the undercurrent of shock. Mom, Sarah called me. He didn't say hello. Straight to the point, as always. She was hysterical. I could barely understand what she was saying. Something about the will. About Dad. Is it true? Yes, David. It's true. There was a pause. I could hear him breathing heavily. How? It's a long story, son. A story I need to tell you all in person. Sarah said he wasn't our father. Any of us. The incredulity in his voice was palpable. For David, a man of facts and logic, this was a miscalculation. An impossible variable in his life's equation. That's what the will says. And I have other proof. Proof? What kind of proof? He demanded, the engineer in him seeking data to analyze the problem. Letters, David. Letters that Richard wrote. Another silence. Longer this time. I imagined him in his home office, surrounded by blueprints and diagrams, his ordered world coming apart. "I'm on my way," he said finally. "I'll be on the road in an hour. I should be there before midnight. Drive carefully," I said. "I always drive carefully, Mom," he replied, and in his clipped response, I felt all his frustration, his anger, his confusion. He didn't know who to aim these feelings at, so they were being aimed at me, the messenger. After hanging up, I took a deep breath and dialed Michael's number in Tulsa. He answered on the second ring, his voice sleepy. "Mom, it's almost 10 o'clock. Is everything all right?" "Michael, I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to talk to you. Your brother and sister are coming to the farm. I need you to come too." "Coming to the farm? In the middle of the week? What happened? Are you okay? Your health?" "I'm fine, physically, but something has happened. Something that changes everything." And then, for the third time that night, I told the story. The short, brutal version. The will. Richard's confession. Michael's reaction was different from the others. There was no audible shock or immediate anger. There was a long, thoughtful silence. "You know," he said finally, his voice strangely calm. "In a sick way. That makes sense. I was taken aback." "What do you mean?" "The way he was. The way he looked at us. Like we were a disappointment. I always thought it was because I wasn't good enough, wasn't the son he wanted, especially when I chose music over farming." "Oh, Michael." "No, Mom, it's okay. I mean, it's not okay. It's insane. But it explains a lot. It explains the emptiness in that house, the emptiness in him." Michael's insight, his ability to see the emotional truth behind the facts, had always been both his gift and his curse. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll hit the road first thing." In the days that followed, the farm transformed. The house, which had been a haven of silence and solitude, now buzzed with a tense energy. The anticipation was a weight in the air. I cleaned the guest rooms, changed the linens, stocked the pantry, automatic movements, domestic tasks to keep my hands busy and my mind from the precipice. Every sound of a car on the gravel road made me jump. I was preparing for a battle, not a battle against my children, but alongside them, against the ghosts of the past. This would not be a family gathering to mourn the loss of a patriarch. It would be a council of war to deal with his betrayal. The house, which for so long had been the stage for Richard's lie, was about to become the stage for my truth. I looked out the kitchen window at the wheat field stretching to the horizon. My whole life, I had felt so small under that immense sky. But now, something had changed. I was no longer hiding. I was waiting. Waiting for my children. Waiting to finally tell them the whole story, no matter how ugly. The storm was coming, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. As I waited for David to arrive, the night deepened. The silence of the house was heavy, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I was drawn back to the metal box, to the last bundle of letters. Michael's story. This one was the hardest, the most painful, because it wasn't born from youthful naivety or a desperate search for warmth, but from a moment of pure abject brokenness. It happened when I was nearly 30. David was 11, Sarah was 8. The marriage to Richard had become a barren landscape of silent resentment. That year was particularly bad. A severe drought had hit Kansas, and the farm was dying. The cornstalks were brown and withered, and the cracked earth looked like an open wound. The financial pressure turned Richard into an even more bitter and cruel man. Every day was a battle. He would spend his nights out drinking, coming home to unload his frustration and anger on me. Not with his fists, never with his fists. His cruelty was more subtle. It was in the way he criticized my cooking, the way he ignored the children, the way he looked at me with a contempt that made me feel smaller than a grain of dust. I felt invisible, worthless. My self-esteem, already fragile, had completely disintegrated. I was trapped, with no education, no money of my own, and 2 children to raise. The outside world felt 1,000,000 miles away. On one of my rare trips to the town of Abilene for supplies, I had a crisis. A sharp pain in my abdomen doubled me over. It was appendicitis. I was rushed to the small hospital. The surgery was a success, but the doctor, Dr. Miller, insisted I stay for a few days of observation. Richard visited me once. He stayed for 5 minutes, complained about the time he was wasting away from the farm, and left. The nurses looked at me with pity. Dr. Miller, however, was kind. He was an older man with tired but gentle eyes. He would sit by my bed and talk to me. He asked me about my life, about my children. He listened, and in my vulnerable, lonely state, his attention was like a balm. He told me about his own unhappy marriage, about his own loneliness. There was a connection, a mutual recognition of two souls trapped in lives they hadn't chosen. When I was discharged, he gave me his personal number, in case you need anything. A few weeks later, on a particularly awful night with Richard, I hit rock bottom. He told me, with a frightening calmness, that I was the reason for all his failures, that I was a burden he had been forced to carry. I felt something inside me break. I drove into town, aimless, tears blurring my vision, and I called Dr. Miller. I don't know what I expected. Maybe just a kind voice on the other end of the line. He invited me to his office, which was closed for the night. What happened that night wasn't about passion or love. It was about desperation. It was about two lonely, broken people seeking a moment of comfort, a moment of oblivion in each other's arms. It was a mistake born of pain, and I regretted it the instant I walked out of his office and back into the dark night. When I found out I was pregnant with Michael, a part of me died. The guilt was a heavy cloak I would never take off. I told Richard, expecting the world to end. But again, he said nothing, just a nod. His silence was my torture. Now, I understood. He knew. The letters in the metal box confirmed it. He had written to Dr. Miller, too, using his veiled language of blackmail. There had been a reply, a letter from a lawyer, threatening Richard with legal action if he ever made contact again. Michael grew up in the shadow of this unspoken tension. He was a quiet, observant child who felt the dysfunction of our family in his bones. He took refuge in music, in his own world, because the world we had given him was cold and broken. Richard ignored him almost completely. It was as if Michael didn't exist for him, and I, in turn, loved him with a painful intensity, a mix of maternal love and crushing guilt. I always wondered if he sensed it, if he sensed there was something different about him. Michael's arrival was the final nail in the coffin of my marriage, even if the burial took another 48 years. And now, I would have to tell him, my quiet, sensitive son, the sordid, sad story of his own conception. Of all the challenges I had faced, this one felt the most cruel. The sound of David's tires on the gravel just before midnight was like a starting gun. I watched him from the kitchen window as he got out of his immaculate sedan, his face tense under the porch light. He walked into the house without knocking, which was unusual for him, and stopped in the middle of the kitchen, looking at me, at the table, at the open metal box. "Mom," he said, his voice low and controlled. He didn't hug me. "Hello, David. Was the drive all right?" I asked, resorting to pleasantries because the real words were too big. "Where is it?" he asked, ignoring my question. "The letter. The will." I pointed to the manila envelope on the table. He picked it up, pulled out the papers, and began to read, standing under the harsh kitchen light. I sat and waited, watching his face. I saw the clenching of a muscle in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned quickly over the lines, the pallor that spread across his skin. He read the document twice. When he was finished, he placed the papers back on the table with careful precision, as if handling radioactive material. "So it's true," he said, more to himself than to me. He looked at me, and his eyes, usually so analytical, were filled with a raw confusion. Who? Who what, David? My father. Who is he? The question was direct, emotionless. Typical David. He needed a fact to replace the fact that had just been destroyed. His name was Thomas Riley, a traveling salesman. "It was a long time ago, David. He left before you were born." He nodded slowly, processing the information. "And the others? Sarah and Michael? They have different fathers, too." David ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I knew well. He began to pace the kitchen, like a caged animal. "This doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. Why did Richard raise us? Why did he stay with you? Why go through this whole charade? That's what I've been trying to understand, David." That's when Sarah arrived. She must have driven nonstop, because she was there much sooner than I'd expected. She rushed into the kitchen and, unlike David, came straight to me, wrapping me in a tight hug. She was crying silently, her body trembling against mine. I held her, a wave of gratitude washing over me for her warmth, her empathy. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry you went through this alone," she whispered into my hair. David stopped pacing and watched the scene, his arms crossed, a look of discomfort on his face. Sarah's open display of emotion always made him uneasy. Michael arrived the next morning, as promised. He came in quietly, his guitar case on his back, his eyes tired from the long drive. He looked at the three of us gathered in the kitchen, me and Sarah sitting at the table, David standing by the window staring out. The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. "Looks like I missed the party," he said, with a touch of his dry humor. No one laughed. He joined us at the table, and silence fell. We were four strangers, bound together by a secret that had just exploded. The house, which for so many years had been a home, now felt like a courtroom. And I was the star witness, the defendant, and in some ways the judge. They were all here, my three children, three very different individuals, each dealing with the news in their own way. David with a cold anger and a need for facts, Sarah with empathetic pain and a need for connection, Michael with a melancholic resignation and a need for understanding. I looked at their faces, faces I knew better than my own. I saw the lines of worry, the shadows of pain, and I knew the moment had come. The moment to tell them everything, not just the facts of Richard's will, but my story, the whole truth, no matter how ugly and painful. It was the least I owed them. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. No one had touched the coffee I'd made. Each mug sat untouched, growing cold on the table. I placed the metal box in the center of the table between the mugs. The sound of metal on wood was the only noise in the room. All eyes turned to it. It all started before I even married. "Richard," I began, my voice a little shaky at first. "I need you to understand how things were back then. For a girl like me, uneducated, from a poor religious family." I looked at David. I was 17. I fell in love, or thought I did, with a man who promised me the world, and then disappeared when I told him I was pregnant. I told them about Thomas Riley, about my panic, my family's shame, the ostracism I faced. Richard came along like a savior, I continued, the bitter irony in my voice. He offered to marry me, to give you a name, David, and to my family, and to me it seemed like the only way out. I didn't know then that he was offering me a cage, not a refuge. I opened the box and took out the first bundle of letters. I found out last night that he knew from the beginning. He found Thomas Riley. He wrote to him, asking for money. A sharp gasp came from Sarah. David just clenched his jaw, his face a mask of controlled fury. I went on, my voice gaining steadiness with every word. I told them about the crushing loneliness of the early years of marriage, about Richard's coldness, about my desperate hunger for any kind of human warmth. I looked at Sarah. "Your story, sweetie, was born from that loneliness." I told them about Daniel Peterson, the musician, about the conversations by the fence, the sound of his guitar on summer nights. I told them about the single afternoon I betrayed my wedding vows. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake that filled me with a guilt I've carried your whole life. But please understand, it was a mistake born of desperation. I showed them the letters Richard wrote to Daniel, the same veiled demand for money. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand, tears streaming through her fingers. She wasn't crying over my infidelity, I realized. She was crying for my pain, for the loneliness that had driven me to that point. Finally, I looked at Michael. This was the hardest. "Michael," my voice failed me. I took a breath. "Your story is the most complicated, because it was born not from a mistake, but from being broken." I told them about the drought, about Richard's escalating cruelty, about how he had broken me psychologically. I told them about the appendicitis, about Dr. Miller's kindness, about the night I hit rock bottom. "There's no excuse for what I did," I said, looking directly into Michael's eyes. "I was broken, and I sought comfort in the wrong place. And you, my darling, were conceived in that moment of darkness. And I am so sorry. I am so sorry if you ever felt different." Michael didn't look away. He just watched me, his face impassive, but his eyes full of an old understanding, as if I were only confirming something his soul had always known. "The bottom line is this," I said, looking at each of them in turn. "I made mistakes, grievous mistakes. I was young and foolish and scared, and later, desperately lonely. I carried the guilt and shame of those mistakes in silence for over 50 years. I thought I was protecting you, holding the family together. But what I need you to understand is that Richard knew. He knew everything, and he didn't forgive me. He didn't confront me. He used my mistakes as a weapon. He punished us, all of us, every single day with his silence, his coldness, his contempt. The man you knew as a father was a jailer. And this house was our prison. The confession hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. I had laid all the truth on the table. The ugly, complicated, painful story of our family. I was exhausted, emptied. There was nothing left to hide. I waited for their verdict. The silence that followed my confession was deafening. It was a silence filled with 50 years of unsaid words, of repressed emotions, of a lifetime of family dynamics that were now being seen in a harsh, new light. David was the first to break it. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Blackmail," he said, the word coming out like a low growl. The man spent his entire life treating us like dirt because he couldn't successfully blackmail our biological fathers. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the wall, but seeing something else, seeing a lifetime of rejection. So, everything. Every time he told me I'd never be good enough, every time he criticized my grades, my choice of career, it was all about this. He turned to me, the anger in his face now clear and focused. "Why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us live under the same roof with that monster?" I didn't know that he knew David. My voice rose, filled with frustration. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if the truth came out, our family would fall apart, that you would be shamed." "Shamed?" He spat the word. "You think a little town gossip would have been worse than this? Worse than growing up feeling like you are fundamentally a disappointment to your own father." "David, don't talk to Mom like that," Sarah cut in, her voice trembling but firm. She stood up and went to him. "Can't you see what she went through? She was a child when it all started. And she's been trapped with him her whole life. She was as much a victim as we were." "I'm not a victim, Sarah," David shot back. "I'm the result of a series of lies. I don't even know who I am. Carter isn't my name. The story I've told myself about where I come from is a sham." He turned to me again. "I want his name, his full name, and the last address you have. What are you going to do?" I asked, afraid. "I'm going to find him," he said with cold determination. "I need answers." While David and Sarah argued, Michael remained silent, watching. He picked up one of Richard's letters, the one addressed to Dr. Miller, and read it. He turned it over and over in his hands, as if trying to absorb the texture of the paper, the ink of the words. Finally, he spoke, his voice so quiet that David and Sarah stopped arguing to listen. "He was a sad man," Michael said. David snorted. "Sad? He was cruel, Michael." "He was both," Michael continued, his eyes still on the letter. "Imagine living your whole life knowing a secret like that, knowing the family you present to the world is a lie, instead of confronting the truth, or leaving, or trying, somehow, to forgive. He chose resentment. He let it eat him alive from the inside until there was nothing left but bitterness. What a terrible way to live." Michael's perspective, his ability to see the humanity even in Richard's monstrosity, silenced everyone. He wasn't excusing Richard. He was explaining him, in a way no one else could. "I don't want to meet Dr. Miller," Michael said, placing the letter back on the table. "He's just a biological detail. He's not part of my story. My story," he looked around the table at each of us, "is about us, the four of us. It's about surviving Richard Carter." Michael's words changed the energy in the room. David's anger didn't subside, but it lost its focus. Sarah's pain found a purpose, and my guilt began to morph into something else. A sense of solidarity. "He's right," Sarah said, wiping her tears. "What Richard did was unforgivable, but what matters now is what we do with it, as a family." "What family?" David said, his voice still hard but with an edge of uncertainty. "We're not even related by blood, apparently." "Of course we're a family," Sarah exclaimed. "Blood isn't the only thing that matters. We grew up together. We survived the same cold house. That makes us more brother and sister than blood ever could." I watched my children, 3 people I had brought into the world under such different circumstances, now forged together in the fire of this revelation. Each of their reactions was so different, so true to who they were, and in the midst of the pain and anger and confusion, I saw something new being born, a brutal honesty, a connection we had never had before, because it had always been obscured by the great lie that ruled our lives. The explosion had happened, and now, in the wreckage, we were beginning to see what was left. The intensity of the morning gave way to an afternoon of heavy exhaustion. The anger and tears had drained everyone. No one knew what to say or do next. David retreated to the back porch, standing with his arms crossed. staring out at the fields as if he could find answers on the horizon line. Michael took his guitar and went to the guest room. Soon, soft, melancholy chords began to float through the house, a soundtrack for our collective grief. Sarah, ever the caregiver, stayed in the kitchen with me. She didn't speak. Instead, she began to move about the kitchen with a quiet familiarity. She filled the kettle with water and put it on the stove. She opened cupboards, found mugs, tea bags. The simple domestic ritual was a balm for frayed nerves. As the water heated, she came and sat beside me at the table. She took my hand. Her hands were warm and soft, the hands of an artist. Mine were rough and stained with earth, the hands of a farmer. But in that moment, we were just a mother and daughter. "I can just imagine how alone you must have felt," she said, her voice low. "All these years." I nodded, unable to speak. Her empathy was such an overwhelming gift it threatened to break the composure I was struggling to maintain. "I used to look at other families," she went on. "At church, at town picnics. I'd see the way fathers looked at their daughters, with pride, with love, and I would wonder why he never looked at me that way. I tried everything to get his approval. I got good grades. I won art contests. Nothing. It was like throwing stones down a bottomless well." She squeezed my hand. "Knowing the truth, it hurts. It hurts so much, but it's also a relief, because it means the problem wasn't me, and it means I can stop trying. I can finally stop waiting for something he was never capable of giving me." The kettle whistled, a shrill sound that cut through the heavy silence. Sarah got up and made 2 cups of chamomile tea. She placed one in front of me. The hot steam rose, carrying a calming scent. "What are you going to do now, Mom?" she asked, blowing gently on her tea. The question caught me off guard. I had been so focused on the past, on telling the story, that I hadn't thought about the future. My future. "I don't know," I admitted. "This house, this farm, it's all so tied to him, to this life. You don't have to decide anything right now," she said quickly. "Just breathe." David came back into the kitchen. His shoulders were less tense. He glanced at the cups of tea. "Is there more?" he asked, his voice softer. Sarah stood and made a cup for him. He took it, murmuring a "thank you." He didn't sit, but leaned against the counter, sipping the tea slowly. The sound of Michael's music still drifted from upstairs. The 3 of us stood there, in a different kind of silence than before. It wasn't a silence of tension, but of truce, a ceasefire. The initial storm had passed, leaving behind a devastated but calm landscape. In that moment, in my old-fashioned kitchen, with my 2 oldest children, drinking tea while my youngest played a sad song upstairs, I felt a glimmer of what could come next. It wouldn't be easy. There would be more hard conversations, more pain to process. But the foundation of lies had been demolished. For the first time, we were standing on solid ground. It was a vacant lot, yes, but it was real. And from here, maybe, just maybe, we could start to build something new. A family forged not by blood or convention, but by the shared truth of their survival. The next few days were strange, suspended in time. My children, who normally had busy lives and tight schedules, canceled their appointments. They stayed. The farm, which for so long had been the domain of one man, now belonged to the 4 of us. We moved through the house with a deliberate caution, as if exploring new and unfamiliar territory. Conversations came in waves. Sometimes we would go for hours in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. Other times, a random memory would trigger an avalanche of discussion. One afternoon, Sarah was flipping through an old photo album. "Remember this Christmas?" she said, pointing to a photo of the 3 of us as children in front of a poorly decorated tree. Dad refused to help us put up the tree. He said it was a waste of time. "I remember," David said, looking over her shoulder. He sat in his armchair, reading the paper, the whole time. "Mom, you spent the entire evening trying to fix the lights that wouldn't work, and I remember wanting that electric train set more than anything," said Michael, who had joined them. "When I opened it on Christmas morning, he looked at the gift and said, 'I hope you don't expect me to play with that with you.'" Small memories like this, once seen as examples of Richard's difficult personality, were now re-examined. Every act of coldness, every word of disdain, every gesture of indifference was put under the new light of the truth, and the pattern that emerged was shocking in its consistency. It wasn't just an unaffectionate man. It was a man who actively refused to participate in his children's joy. Their anger, initially scattered and confused, began to solidify and focus on a single target: Richard's memory. David's anger at me subsided, replaced by a reluctant understanding. He started asking me questions, not about my past, but about his with Richard. "Did he ever praise you once?" he asked me one evening as we were washing dishes together. I thought for a long time. "Once," I said. "You were about 16. You fixed the tractor engine that even the mechanic in town couldn't fix. When you were done, he just looked at the engine, looked at you, and said, seems to work." For him, that was the equivalent of a parade in your honor. David smiled, a sad, humorless smile. "Yeah, I remember that. I held on to that for weeks." Even Michael, who had always seemed the most detached, began to share. He told us how, when he first started learning guitar, Richard would complain about the noise and make him practice in the barn, even in the dead of winter. I think he couldn't stand the idea of me finding joy in something that had nothing to do with him or the farm. Michael mused. They were rewriting their own histories, dismantling the narrative that they were inadequate children to a demanding father and replacing it with the truth. They were normal kids who had the misfortune of being raised by a broken, resentful man. As I witnessed these conversations, as I listened to their recontextualized memories, something inside me began to shift too. The guilt I had carried for so long began to recede. I saw that despite my mistakes, despite the terrible circumstances of their births, I had managed to do one thing right. I had loved them. I had shielded them as best I could from his coldness. I had given them the warmth that was lacking in that house. One evening, we were all sitting on the porch, watching the stars. The air was cool and clean. "You know, Mom," Sarah said, breaking the comfortable silence, "my whole life, I thought our family was sad. Now I realize it wasn't. It was a family with a big, sad secret at the center of it. But us, the four of us, we weren't sad. We were the ones trying to bring light into the darkness." I looked at my 3 children, now adults, sitting with me on the porch of the house that had for so long been a prison, and I saw that Sarah was right. We weren't our pain. We were its survivors, and our perspective, finally unified, was the key to our freedom. After nearly a week of living together on the farm, the atmosphere began to shift again. The shock and anger phase gave way to one of pragmatism. The big question hung in the air, unspoken. What now? It was David, as expected, who brought it to the forefront. We were having breakfast, and he put his coffee cup down on the table with a decisive thud. "We need to make some decisions," he announced. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a declaration. "First, what do we do with the information we have? Do you want to try and find these people? Our biological fathers?" The question hung in the morning stillness. It was the central question, the crossroads where we now stood. Sarah was the first to answer. "I've thought a lot about it," she said slowly. "A part of me is curious, of course. I wonder what he's like, if I look like him, if I inherited my artistic talent from him. But," she hesitated, "I'm 52 years old. I've had a life. To seek him out now, what would it change? It wouldn't erase the pain of growing up without a loving father. And in a way, it feels like a betrayal to everything the 4 of us have been through together. My family is you." Michael nodded. "I agree with Sarah. I have no interest in meeting a stranger who technically contributed half my DNA. My father, for better or worse, was the man who ignored me in this house. And my mother," he looked at me, "is the woman who raised me. That's all I need to know." All eyes turned to David. He was the one who had wanted facts, who seemed the most shaken by the loss of his identity. His answer was the most uncertain. He was silent for a long time, looking down at his hands. "I've spent the last few days obsessed with the idea of finding this Thomas Riley," he admitted. "I wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to demand, I don't know, an apology, something. But the more I think about it, the more I realize he doesn't owe me anything. He was a scared kid who made a mistake and ran. The person who owed me something was Richard. He owed me honesty. He owed me kindness. He owed me a chance. And he failed on every count. Chasing the ghost of Thomas Riley isn't going to fix what Richard broke." He looked at me. "I think, for now, the answer is no. Maybe someday the curiosity will win. But today, I just want to focus on fixing what we have right here." A weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. The thought of dredging up more of the past, of inviting more strangers into our already complicated equation, was exhausting. Their decision, unanimous, was an act of self-definition. They were choosing the family they knew, the family that survived, over the family that might have been. The second decision, David continued, is about this place. Mom, what do you want to do with the farm? I looked around the kitchen, at the walls that held so many memories, good and mostly bad. I can't live here anymore, I said, the decision forming in my mind with a sudden clarity. This place is his house. It's his monument to his bitterness. I need a place that's mine. You could come live with me in Denver, Sarah offered immediately, or spend some time in Tulsa. The music scene is great for all ages, Michael joked, trying to lighten the mood. Or you could move closer to me in Kansas City. I'd help you find an apartment, David said. Their offers, so quick and genuine, brought tears to my eyes. For the first time, they weren't seeing me as the stoic matriarch who took care of everything, but as a person who needed care. Thank you, I said, my voice thick. Thank you all, but I don't want to leave. Not really. This land, this part of Kansas, it's in my blood, but I don't need this house. I don't need hundreds of acres to look after. I want something small, a little house in town maybe, with a garden, a place where I can plant my roses. They looked at each other, and for the first time in days, I saw them all smile, a genuine smile. A rose garden sounds perfect, Mom, Sarah said. We'll help you find the place, David said, and we'll help you sell this farm. We'll take care of all the paperwork. In that moment, a decision was made. Not just a decision about finding biological fathers or selling a property. It was a collective decision to move on from the past, to stop living in the shadow of Richard Carter. We were no longer just reacting to the bomb he had thrown into our lives. We were starting to build our own future, on our own terms, and that felt like the beginning of true freedom. The decision to sell the farm was like opening the windows in a room that had been sealed for 50 years. The fresh air of possibility rushed in, sweeping away the dust and must of the past. My children, each with their unique skills, sprang into action. David, the pragmatic engineer, became the project manager. He researched real estate agents, consulted lawyers, and created spreadsheets to organize the process. He handled the logistics with an efficiency that turned a daunting task into a series of manageable steps. Watching him take control, not with anger but with constructive purpose, was like seeing him finally claim his power in the family. Sarah, the artist, became the keeper of memories. She spent days sifting through the house, not to pack, but to curate. She helped us decide what to keep. The childhood photos that captured moments of genuine joy, in spite of everything. The patchwork quilt I had made. The small rocking chairs my father had made for them. And she helped us decide what to leave behind. Richard's leather armchair, his clothes, the objects that carried the weight of his presence. The process was cathartic, a conscious separation of what nourished us from what poisoned us. Michael, the musician, became the emotional historian. He had me sit with him for hours with a tape recorder and asked me to tell stories. Not the big, painful truths, but the small ones. Stories about my own childhood, about my parents, about the songs my mother used to sing. He was helping me reclaim my own story, the story of Margaret Miller, the woman who existed before she became Mrs. Carter. He filled the house with music, no longer melancholic but hopeful, as if composing a new soundtrack for our future. Together, we emptied the house. Every object removed, every box packed, felt like a weight being lifted from my shoulders. When we finally found a small house for me in the nearby town of Abilene, a charming bungalow with a porch and a yard perfect for a rose garden, the move was swift. On the last day at the farm, after the moving truck had departed, the four of us walked through the empty house. Our voices echoed in the bare rooms. Where there had once been oppression, there was now space. Where there had been secrets, there was now just light streaming through the naked windows. We went out onto the back porch and looked out at the wheat fields, golden under the late afternoon sun. Goodbye, Richard, David said quietly, to the air. It wasn't said with anger, but with a quiet finality, a closing. Sarah hugged me. A new beginning, Mom. A new beginning for all of us, I added. The days of saying goodbye to them were different from all the farewells before. Previously, they had been leaving the heavy house of their childhood, returning to their own lives as a form of escape. Now, they were leaving a mother they saw in a new way, a woman who wasn't just a constant in their lives, but a person with her own journey ahead. The hugs were longer. The words, "I love you," were said more easily, with more meaning. They were no longer running from a painful past. They were moving toward futures that, while still uncertain, were now theirs to write, free from the toxic influence that had shaped them for so long. When the last car disappeared down the gravel road, I stood alone on the porch of my new home. The house was small, the walls smelled of fresh paint, and there were no ghosts in the corners. I was by myself, but for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel lonely. I felt a quietness, a peace. The house wasn't empty. It was full of promise. The months that followed were a rediscovery. Living alone in my little house in Abilene was like learning to breathe after spending a lifetime with a weight on my chest. The mornings were my own. I drank my coffee on the porch, watching the town slowly wake up, without the pressure of making breakfast for a silent, sullen man. The first thing I did was plant my garden. I dug into the earth with my own hands, feeling the rich, damp soil. I planted rose bushes of every color, red, yellow, pink. I planted lavender and rosemary. Tending that small patch of earth became my therapy. Every new leaf, every budding flower, was a small victory, a testament that life could flourish even after a long, hard winter. I reconnected with people who had been relegated to the margins of my life. Old school friends who, like me, were widows. We started meeting for coffee once a week. At first, I was hesitant to share my story. The old shame, the old need to keep up appearances, was a hard habit to break. But one day, sitting with two friends, Martha and Eleanor, the story just came out. I told them everything. About the will, about Richard, about the secrets. I expected shock, judgment, maybe even pity. Instead, I received understanding. Martha told me about her husband's secret alcoholism. Eleanor confessed to the profound loneliness she felt in her own outwardly perfect marriage. I discovered that every woman of my generation had her own locked metal box, her own secrets kept to maintain the peace. My story, rather than isolating me, connected me to them in a deeper way. We weren't saints. We were survivors. The community, which I had feared would ostracize me, surprised me. News travels fast in a small town, and I know people whispered, but the whispers changed. I was no longer just poor widow Carter. I was that Margaret, what a strong woman. People looked at me differently at the grocery store, at the post office, not with pity, but with a new kind of respect. They didn't know all the sordid details, but they knew the gist. I had survived a hard life and was starting over at 74, and that, apparently, was something people admired. My children called constantly. Our conversations were different, lighter, more honest. We talked not just about the grand dramas of life, but about the small things. A book Sarah was reading, a new musical arrangement Michael was working on, a challenging project David was tackling. They asked for my advice. They shared their joys and frustrations. I was no longer just the repository for the family's problems. I was an active participant in their lives. I found myself. The woman I was before Richard, the girl who dreamed of the future, wasn't dead. She'd only been sleeping. And now, she was waking up. I began reading voraciously again, as I had in my youth. I joined a book club at the local library. I started taking morning walks. Small things, perhaps, but to me they were monumental. They were acts of self-affirmation. One day I was looking in my bathroom mirror. For decades I had avoided my own reflection. I saw only a tired woman, with lines of worry etched into her face. But on this day, I really looked. I saw the wrinkles, yes, but I saw them as a map of my journey. I saw the silver in my hair, not as a sign of age, but as a crown. And in my eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen in a long, long time. A glimmer, a spark. It was the light of Margaret, finally free. Tonight I'm sitting on my porch, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in my hands. The sun is setting over the Kansas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. It's a vast, quiet beauty that once felt oppressive, but now feels like a promise. The promise that every day has an end, and every night gives way to a new dawn. The air is fragrant with the scent of my roses. They have bloomed magnificently this year. Their thorns remind me that beauty often comes with pain, that strength requires the ability to protect oneself. It's a lesson it took me 74 years to learn. The house behind me is quiet. It's a peaceful quiet, not the heavy, oppressive silence of the farm. It is the sound of my own company, and I've discovered I quite like it. I am no longer defined by my role as a wife, or even just as a mother. I am Margaret, a woman who loves roses and books and the sound of rain on the roof, a woman who made mistakes but refused to be destroyed by them. My children are doing well. David did not look for Thomas Riley. He said that in the end, he realized the only father whose approval he ever really needed was his own. He is calmer, happier. Sarah is flourishing in her art, creating pieces filled with a new emotional depth. And Michael composed an entire album of songs inspired by our story. He's calling it The Unspoken. He says it's about how the truth, no matter how painful, can set you free to create something beautiful. I think of Richard sometimes. Not with anger, not anymore. The anger has burned itself out, leaving behind only a kind of hollow sadness. Sadness for a life wasted on bitterness. Sadness for a man who had a family before him but chose to embrace resentment instead of love. I don't forgive him. Not in the traditional sense. To forgive him would be to minimize the pain he caused. But I have released him. I have released him from my mind, from my heart. He has no more power over me. I have learned that the truth can hurt. It can slice and burn and tear down everything you thought was solid, but it also heals. It cleanses the wound, allows the air in, and lets new growth begin. The truth didn't change my past, but it changed how I see it. And more importantly, it has freed my future. My story is a testament that it is never too late. Never too late to discover who you are, to reclaim your own narrative, to find peace. At 74 years old, I am finally free. Free from the past, free from the secrets, free to simply be. And if my journey, with all its painful twists and turns, has resonated with you, if it has given you a sliver of hope, or made you feel a little less alone in your own silent battles, then the act of telling it has been worth it. Stories like mine remind us of the resilience of the human spirit. If you believe in the power of sharing these truths, I invite you to subscribe to the channel, to leave a like or a comment below. Because every story shared is a light in the darkness, and together, we can illuminate the path for one another. Thank you for listening.